The world now lay in shambles. Its current leaders had fled or perished, the surviving population was scattered and lawless, and the zombie numbers only grew by the day. The world needed to reorganize, to begin to regain a sense of order and structure, to rebuild or counterattack. But first it had to restabilize, and with little trust left in the fleeing populace, it was clear they were the priority to save. One man is largely credited with doing so, and much of the information on him comes from Zolelwa Anzania, who now lives on Robben Island as he writes his own accounts of the war. One of the most influential and controversial figures of the middle period of the war was Paul Reddecker. In his adult life, Reddecker believed humanity's greatest weakness was emotion. It's one great flaw, which already tells you a lot about him. It was this attitude that, in the 80s, won the attention of the apartheid government. With the South African border war raging and social tensions stemming from apartheid, the government feared an all-out revolt, and believed Reddecker was the man to help them succeed with Plan Orange, a doomsday scenario for the Afrikaner population in the event of an indigenous uprising and the loss of the war. This involvement with the government have since led some to call Reddecker racist. Reddecker himself describes racism as a regrettable byproduct of irrational emotion, and when revising Plan Orange, wasted no time in making sure he was just as hated by the Afrikaners too. Reddecker's plan was essentially triage, saving the most worthwhile people, based on IQ, fertility, income, and some other less specified, desirable qualities. The white supremacists did not take kindly to being supremacied themselves, and among the radical fundamentalist Afrikaners he was the most hated man in the world. So following the dissolution of apartheid, Reddecker lived in a small cabin in the Drakensberg. It was here where he was found in the Great Panic. A special ops unit stormed his cabin and asked if he was the author of the old plan for Orange 84. They knew he had a plan for the zombie outbreaks, even if it was just an intellectual exercise for him. The Reddecker plan was quietly adopted by many governments worldwide, and has since been one of the most debated topics post-war, now being studied in history classes in schools all over the planet. Again, Reddecker relied on triage, with half the armed forces eaten in many countries, and great leaderless masses of the public scattered to the winds. There was no way everyone could be saved. Rather, they had to gather as many as they could in a single area, ideally protected by some natural boundary, that would provide a defense in depth against the dead. This would include the remains of the military to protect and train the civilians. It was what happened to those that got left behind that make Reddecker so hated. The remainers were bait. With zombie numbers now in the tens of millions at least, there was no way the newly formed settlements could defend themselves against the hordes at full strength. They needed to be scattered piecemeal across the nations of the earth, so the main population centres could recoup, recover and re-strategize the next stage of their plan. So smaller sub-populations were set up. These were to be as well stocked and well guarded as could be managed, but that was only so they could fulfill their one purpose, to keep as much of the dead focused entirely on them and away from the main population centres. If they were overwhelmed, then they were overwhelmed. Reddecker was brought to a bunker in Kimberley to meet the surviving members of the cabinet, which were in uproar at both his presence and his idea. One elder member, who turned out to be Nelson Mandela, calms the others and embraces Reddecker, claiming that he'll be the one to save their people. Anzania believes this was too much for Reddecker, that he broke down afterwards, and has been shut away ever since. In fact, he tries to argue Reddecker's famously sociopathic dispassion to everything was actually a defense mechanism, that he was actually a very sensitive individual, scarred by the brutality he saw in apartheid South Africa, and so walled off his ability to feel. Or, much of the suggestions could well be lies. Robben Island isn't now normal accommodation but a psychiatric institution. The name on Anzania's cell is Paul Reddecker. The story about a psychotic break and then hugging South Africa's most beloved figure, as well as changing his name to throw others off the scent, and getting cared for the rest of his life in a secure institute, all sound like the actions of a clinical and calculating operator, aware of the emotions he would awaken in others. Reddecker always believed people would come for him for his plans. It's likely he had defense mechanisms all right, but it seems more likely he shielded himself in the belief of others that he had some good in him. Governments all over the world began to implement their own variations of the Reddecker plan. In Germany it was known as the Prochnow Plan, and Philipp Adler was there when it was first enforced. He was fighting a losing struggle at Hamburg that had been severely hit by massed hordes of ghouls. They had attempted to make the most of what little they had, using abandoned cars to form barricades, and using water cannons to blast zombies into the River Elbe, where they were trapped. But all of these were just temporary measures. They had over 1,000 civilians holed up in a metalworks, and even more still at the airport, with no telling how many had been bitten. In short, the situation was bad, and they were running out of options and resources. Then he got the order to retreat. Most of their forces had been pulling back for a while now, so that wasn't too unusual. But what surprised him was their new rendezvous point, Schafstedt, some 80 kilometers northwest and on the other side of the Kiel Canal, a vast artificial waterway acting like Europe's Suez Canal, allowing ships to save almost 300 miles and stormy Danish straits from their journey, or in this case as the barrier against the undead. Not only that, but he was told to leave the civilians, and not even inform them of what was going on. Adler was certain it had to be a mistake. After repeatedly trying to get clarification, he found himself speaking to General Lang, who himself confirmed everything. When Adler protested, his general threatened a decimation of their own if he didn't comply. One look at his garrison and Adler meekly submitted. Leaving the city, Adler believes they got what they deserved. Expletives, excrement, and possessions were flung at them as Adler's lies that they'd return were seen right through. Adler gives a final salute to the rapid reaction stabilization units on the way, and later found out they were one of the units designated as expendable. Their commander had saved Adler's life earlier, and that was the final straw. When he returned to their command, he was going to kill Lang himself. Adler had it all planned. An apology, his report, and listen to what the general had to say. Then, before shaking his hand at the end, paint the wall with his brains. And any of his staff too. Ultimately, Lang couldn't even give him that. Upon hearing that Adler's convoy had crossed the canal, and they were the final ones to do so, Lang wrote his final orders, sealed a letter to his family, and painted the wall with his brains himself. Yet Adler got no satisfaction from it. Even now he only hates him even more. Ultimately he views him as a deserter. He knew what lay ahead for their country and humanity, but couldn't shoulder the guilt of what was necessary to save it. Above all else, he views him as a coward for refusing to live with the consequences of his actions. As bad as the Reddecker plan was, some governments devised even more despicable methods to halt further infections and limit the spread of Solanum, as Bohdan Kondratwyk found. Fighting to try and stop the plague in Ukraine, him and his unit had been pushed from city to city in a string of losing battles. As the military were repeatedly overwhelmed by the undead, they were quickly losing ground to. They had been flinging stockpiles of old munitions and different tactics at the hordes that only ever came up unsuccessful. Their safe zone was being shifted again, this time to the Crimean Peninsula, and Kondratwyk was overseeing the evacuation in Kiev. At Potona Bridge, the situation was a mess. They had been promised riot gear, armour and dogs to actually sort the evacuees through the city, but had been supplied with none of it. The infrastructure was damaged by fighting, and the bridge itself blocked with ruined cars. Short of literally stripping panicked civilians naked, Kondratwyk's unit had no way to actually sort the bitten from the masses of refugees. Fights were breaking out, people were getting killed, and all the way Kondratwyk was trying to radio for help, or gear, or just to actually get a proper evacuation going. As well as the raging fire on the other side of the river, he also began to hear something else too. The signature moan of a massed horde of zombies. On top of that, Kondratwyk also noticed military jets, streaking low over the crowds of both humans and zombies alike. They circled, banked low, and began to fly straight for them. Clearly they'd found their target, and Kondratwyk believed they were planning to detonate the bridge still crowded with civilians. What came was worse. The jets dropped their payload and Kondratwyk believed he had a second to dive for cover, before he saw the parachutes deploy. At that he rushed to the nearest tank, climbing in and screaming for them to button down the hatches. The gunner was sobbing, the driver frozen like a fawn, the commander balled up on the floor, as outside it began to rain. The civilians' limbs soon began to tremble. Many began to stumble or collapse, rubbing their eyes with gaping mouths as they fought to speak, move, and eventually breathe. The jets had deployed VX nerve agent, immensely lethal and recognised as a weapon of mass destruction, being outlawed for conventional warfare in 1993. The government had now found a use for their old stockpiles. VX is an odourless amber liquid and is absorbed through the skin, whereupon it disrupts signalling from the nerves to the muscles, resulting in asphyxiation when the diaphragm fails to operate. To stop further spread into the country and separate the infection, the government had simply culled the living to filter the bitten out. The tanks then dealt with the remaining zombies as best they could. As Kondratwyk leaves, he saw other jets diving over the other bridges, and the city centre too. The last thing he remembers was seeing the Motherland statue positioned at the Great Patriotic War Museum complex, her eyes looking down on them as she watched them flee. Originally from Wisconsin, Jessica Hendricks returns to the Sand Lakes Wilderness Park in Manitoba, Canada, every year to try and help with the cleanup. As well as the yearly Z sweep to clear frozen zombies, it's an attempt to restore the ecosystem by removing wreckage and debris left by the waves of fleeing people in the Great Panic. It's a slow effort so far, and Hendricks was there on day one to watch how the area turned from stunning boreal forests and lakes to a grey wasteland. Unlike some others, the US government didn't completely abandon its people, arguably. Whilst it had its own Red Decker plan variant, telling everyone close enough to come west of the Rocky Mountains, which would serve as their natural barricade, it gave official PSAs to everyone else to head north and get above the snow line as fast as they could. An official warning and not gassing them in the streets was more than some other nations, and Hendricks doesn't hold anger at the government for its own Red Decker plan. Rather, she even understands, viewing the practicality of the situation. Instead, she views the lack of genuine survival advice on what happened after you got north as their cardinal sin. Their own decision to flee was made 2 weeks after Yonkers, and 3 days after the government began to draw west to the Rockies. Sensationalist news had exploded after Yonkers and was mainly full of garbage, but all agreed that heading north was the main thing to do. The family already lived in Waukesha, Wisconsin, that was already considerably above the snow line and shouldn't have needed to go further north, but her father was adamant. He'd got a rifle, warm clothes, as much canned food as they could carry, half a pharmacy and cooking utensils. He'd never used the rifle and only bought it after Yonkers, but still. Despite being a gentleman who could never say no to his daughter and was always the good cop parent, he had their life over the border figured out already. A true Huckleberry Finn adventure, with roast venison on the bone and wild berries off the bush, and all the cuddly forest friends his daughter could pet. He'd never even been camping as a child, but still, away they went. The Civilian Survival Guide advises against rushing out in the first waves or the initial panic, and rather barricading and preparing your own home against the undead. Whilst they did live in a populated area, if sufficiently above the snow line already, then simply a move to the country should have sufficed with the current supplies they had. Along the way he scoffed at anyone he saw camping, believing they should get as far north as they could possibly go. They had loaded the roof with spare fuel canisters too, and thankfully so. Almost every station they passed on the way up was already empty, and plenty hitchhikers lined the road. Any good Samaritan stopping to help one was quickly swamped. At one point, they did pick up a profusely grateful hitchhiker of their own, called Patty, but things quickly got suspicious when they saw a bloody bandage on her arm. Patty insisted it was from a cut, but Hendrik's parents were quiet for the rest of the drive. Later, she was woken by the passenger door slamming shut and her dad flooring it. When she asked her parents, she was told this was the location Patty had asked them to drop her off at. But Hendrix thought she could see her running after them in the window. Overall, it was just another thing to block out, like the other hitchhikers too. The ones shambling in the road who raised their arms and moaned as the car came past. But when they finally reached Manitoba, and had their campsite by the lake in the early August sunshine, the Huck Finn fantasy did seem to be coming true. There were a handful of other families, enough for a nice community, and for sufficient backup should the ghouls come lurking, and the food was as good as promised too, with plenty game to hunt, berries to pick, and fish to catch. People were lazy and used dynamite to fish, one of the most destructive methods, that turned a renewable source of fish, frogs, and crustaceans throughout the year into an empty, polluted puddle. But it worked in the short term and provided plenty of food for the nightly sing-along cookouts, where they had wasteful multi-tree bonfires instead of the amount of wood they actually needed. For the first month, it truly was a wasteful paradise. Then the second and third waves of people came. People from even as far as Mexico. Camps quickly became crowded, and people were down to burning stumps and leaves. Then plastic and rubbish for fuel. The lakes had been emptied and the game chased off, but the snows came too, and the risk of any zombies froze. The problem was, no one knew how to survive that far north, or even if they'd stayed further south. Even after the Great Panic, many people still had a home-by-Christmas attitude, and had taken electronics and valuables with them, and still used money to acquire goods and services. No one had really prepared properly, and Hendrix often saw classic survival faux pas, like drinking to stay warm, or shedding too many layers after working up a sweat. By mid-September, sickness was prevalent in the camps. Rations were running low and tensions were running high, and confrontations sometimes even reached the point of murder. Hendrix remembers her own father coming back white-faced after one such confrontation when someone tried to rob them. Some people attempted to head back down south, having burned their fuel or used it for their car heater. Going on foot was then their only option. The Civilian Survival Guide does admittedly encourage the practice of going north as well, even describing tundra as the most human-friendly environment on Earth in a zombie uprising, with the dead being frozen in winter and summer midnight sun meaning humans are on much better footing with ghouls sense-wise. But in a rush to identify what disabled zombies, they clearly missed out what would also disable humans too. As it says of other terrains, never forget that the environment can kill you as easily as the Walking Dead. By November, things had gotten incredibly severe. Hendrix was badly malnourished, with a bad case of kwashiorkor, her stomach swollen from her body being unable to draw fluids from tissues into the bloodstream, and the cellular matrix degrading. From other vitamin deficiencies, her mouth was ulcerated and her skin lesioned too. Overall, they were desperate for calories and quality protein. One night outside, Hendrix could hear her parents screaming at one another, arguing over a choice they had to make. Her mother claimed they weren't the ones who had even done it, so it wasn't that bad. Her father argued that they should never stoop to that level. After a personal, expletive-laden rant from her mother, she hears the unmistakable sound of her dad punching her mother out. He entered to grab their survival radio, and later returned with a bucket of hot stew. They fed her in slow mouthfuls, refusing to tell her what the meat is. A few weeks later, both Hendrix's parents got sick themselves, and she no longer had any delusions about what she'd eaten. Around the grey waste they try to clear up, bone piles are prevalent, not from elk or deer or any game species, Unlike the half-chewed mess left by stiff zombie jaws, these have been scraped clean and cracked for the marrow. As sickness and malnutrition raged through the camp, things quietened down as people began to drop, and by Christmas Day there was plenty of food. Statistics say 11 million people died that winter, the first grey winter, from the sheer amounts of ash and pollutants belched into the sky from nuclear fallout in Iran and Pakistan, and desperate humans burning whatever they could to survive. All over Northern Europe, Hendrix's drama repeated itself 100,000 times, as desperate refugees fled north to escape the dead, not counting the danger desperation can pose. In India, Udaipur is slowly starting to come back to life, with its lake palace Jagmandir being its main centre of activity. One of the men crucial to its restoration, Sardar Khan, was also there to see the final actions to save what it could of India's populace. At the time he was just a lance corporal, and not even a true soldier, only an engineer with the Border Roads Organisation. After a superior, Sergeant Mukherjee, stuffed him into a jeep at Shimla on finding out that he could drive, the two were winding their way up a mountain road to where they'd be closing the pass. The Indian equivalent of the Red Decker plan was telling as many people as could make it before a certain date to get past the mountain roads and head up into the Himalayas, before detonating charges to blow the roads and leave the mountain chasms and cliff walls as their barriers against the undead. As they approached the pass just minutes from crunch time, understandably the scene was pure chaos. Thousands of people were still streaming up the road to escape and get to the safe zone in time. Hundreds of screaming macaques leapt between people and over buildings as the scent of the coming hordes drove them up the same route. It seemed like every second someone lost their footing and went over the cliff edge. Khan even saw an entire bus go over the side. The pass was meant to be clear for detonation, but now no one was willing to actually take action against the hordes of civilians. As Mukherjee argued with the radio about this, they were interrupted by the presence of General Raj Singh. Known as the Tiger of Delhi, Raj Singh was a highly regarded figure in India's own initial combat against the undead, leading troops in a risky mission to try and save civilians trapped in the Ambedkar Stadium, only to become attacked themselves, and form a shooting square in Gandhi Park. Despite their success against the zombies, Singh was knocked unconscious by his own men as they pulled out, and in meeting Khan he still has the bandage and the eye patch to prove it. He explained they had to blow the pass now, or there was a fighter bomber ordered to deploy Shiva's wrath and use a thermonuclear device to bomb the passage. Not only would this be wildly destructive, Khan believed it would turn the mountain pass into a much more gentle slope of rubble that would let the undead stagger right into the Indian Himalayan safe zone. Unlike General Lang, Raj Singh was willing to follow through and detonate the charges himself so no one else had to shoulder the guilt and responsibility. He spares Mukherjee and takes the detonator from him, whispered a prayer and pushed the button. To no effect. Something, somewhere, had gone wrong. Raj Singh ordered Khan and Mukherjee to get to safety in Shimla, before he charged into the crowd to find the charges and manually detonate them himself. Both disobeyed, and tried to follow him as his personal guard, but both lost him near instantly in the crowd. Khan attempted firing his rifle into the air to disperse the people, but there was no more room left for panic, or so he thought. He saw Mukherjee tumble over the side as someone tried to wrestle his rifle from him. Khan climbed a minibus in an attempt to see his general, and was met with a sudden stench carried by the wind, and a familiar moan with it. Half a kilometre down, the human snake turned into an undead one, every bit as densely packed as the refugees. At this, it turned out there was more room for panic indeed, and the crowd turned into a stampede. Khan was knocked from the bus and trampled in the crowd. As he pulled himself under the bus, he swore he wouldn't let the dead get him, and attempted to bash his own head in on the undercarriage of the vehicle. Suddenly, he almost got his wish, as the ground rose up beneath him and smacked his forehead into the metal, knocking him out cold. Considerable time later, Khan woke to the constant moan of the zombies, the warble of his radio, and a distant tapping sound. Pulling himself back out from under the bus, the road was now completely deserted. Just scattered possessions litter the tarmac, and behind him lies a gaping, charred chasm. The stream of zombies eagerly pursue him, only to topple off the edge and tumble to the valley floor below, the tapping coming from their breaking bodies. General Raj Singh was successful in his mission, and Khan listens to the radio telling him the other mountain passes have been detonated too, and their safe zone is now just that, a safe zone. Thanks for watching, and thanks to, as ever, to my patrons, the Superist Duper, Samburgo, Case Sandom, Big Al, Holden, Beastomorph, Nickname 3110, Eringar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zayser, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu, whose ongoing generosity really helps keep the channel going. A huge thanks to CJ Broskin too, very generously creating the first moody art piece for the series, with his art depicting part of the Hendrix voyage north. If you would like to see more of their art, there's both more of it to come in future videos, and their assorted links are provided in the description as well. I'm glad everyone enjoyed the last video, and hopefully this one goes down well too. This chapter definitely had a lot less to work with analysis-wise, being a chapter much more about the human experiences in the apocalypse, over the surrounding lore of how it went down and what happened as a result. Similarly, some segments lend themselves to this format a lot better than others. Sharon's chapter from the last video is one of the best written in the book and best acted in the audiobook, but doesn't translate well to my particular brand of video. But the next one will be much more like parts 1 and 2. For this one, Paul Reddecker is also left a lot more ambiguous in the book, but at the same time that's also one of Brooks's wilder writing choices, and I felt fairly certain it had to be him trying to pull the wool over everyone else's eyes, rather than South Africa's most beloved figure embracing the sociopath. This is probably also the darkest chapter in the book, and some of the most successfully dark zombie media, without just spilling over into pure edge. But as ever, let me know what you thought. And there's plenty more to come.